On March 5th, 2026, two Iranian Arash-2 drones crossed into Azerbaijan and struck Nakhchivan International Airport. Now, most people watching this story on the news would see a small incident in an obscure corner of the Caucasus. But what happened in Nakhchivan isn't a small story, because that airport sits on the edge of the single most important flight corridor still connecting Europe to Asia. And if that corridor closes, there is no good alternative. Not for British Airways, Lufthansa, Qantas, or anyone else flying between the two continents. To understand why, you need to see the map. Before 2022, the vast majority of flights between Europe and Asia took the Siberian route, straight across Russia, London to Tokyo, Frankfurt to Seoul, Paris to Beijing. It was fast, direct, and used by virtually every European and Asian carrier. Then, war in the Ukraine started, and Russia closed its airspace to Western airlines and vice versa. Overnight, the primary highway between Europe and Asia disappeared. Airlines scrambled for alternatives, and they found them in the Middle East. One corridor ran up through Iraqi airspace, north into Turkey, with Qatar and Bahrain feeding traffic into it from below. Others ran through Iranian airspace, heavily used by the Gulf carriers, Emirates, Qatar Airways, Etihad, routing north through Iran into Turkey and on to Europe. Iran alone was handling over 1,000 overflights a day. These corridors became the new backbone of intercontinental aviation. But they were never stable. After Iran and Israel exchanged strikes in October 2024, most Western carriers began avoiding Iranian airspace altogether, and the June 2025 conflict shut it down temporarily. But airlines adapted because Iraqi airspace still worked, and the system held barely. Then on February 28th this year, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike campaign against Iran. Iran retaliated with missiles and drones across the entire region. And one by one, the dominoes fell. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait all closed their airspace entirely. Then the UAE did as well. Every single Middle Eastern route connecting Europe to Asia went dark, with over 700 flights cancelled in a single day and more than 19,000 experiencing significant delays in a single weekend. What was left to fly from Europe to Asia were two options: a long southern bypass through Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, and the Caucasus corridor, a narrow strip of airspace threading through Georgia and Azerbaijan. The Caucasus corridor is now carrying a staggering share of the world's long-haul traffic. Here's how it works. A British Airways flight from London to Singapore, for example, departs Heathrow, crosses continental Europe, flies over the Black Sea, enters Georgian airspace, crosses Azerbaijan, passes over the Caspian Sea, and then continues through Turkmenistan and Central Asia before heading south toward its destination. It works the same in reverse. Qantas coming from Sydney, Cathay Pacific from Hong Kong, Japan Airlines from Tokyo, and Singapore Airlines all threading through the same corridor heading west into Europe. But look at the map and you'll see the problem. At its narrowest point, this corridor is roughly 100 miles wide. To the north, Russian airspace, closed to Western carriers since 2022. To the south, Iranian airspace, an active war zone. There is no room to deviate. And the corridor is being crushed by demand. Azerbaijan's overflight traffic has grown 173% since 2019, surpassing 229,000 flights a year. During the June 2025 Iran crisis, Azerbaijan absorbed 110 additional flights every single day. This time, it's worse. Around 30 major airlines have now rerouted through this corridor. British Airways, Lufthansa, Air France, KLM, Swiss, Singapore Airlines, Qantas, Virgin Atlantic, Malaysia Airlines. And that's just the passenger carriers. DHL, Aerologic, and other cargo operators are threading through here too. The global supply chain between the two largest economic blocs on the planet is now running through a 100-mile gap in the sky. And today, drones struck an airport on its edge. If the Caucasus corridor becomes unusable, airlines have three theoretical alternatives. None of them work. The remaining option runs from Oman up through Saudi Arabia, across Egypt, and out into the Mediterranean, and while it functions, it has serious problems. First, the geometry. For flights departing Northern Europe and heading to China, Korea, or Japan, this route forces you south to go east, then north again. It adds anywhere from 2 to 5 hours, depending on the route, with fuel cost increases estimated at 40% per flight. Second, the route is already compromised. Parts of Saudi airspace are restricted due to military activity. Iranian drones have struck targets in Riyadh. And Egypt has been plagued by GPS spoofing for years. Aircraft flying over the Cairo flight information region have received false positions, their navigation systems showing them over Tel Aviv when they're actually over Egypt. This isn't a theoretical risk, but rather failures which have been documented repeatedly since 2023, and they've gotten worse. Third, this route is congested. Every carrier that lost the Iraqi and Iranian corridors is already piling onto it. It was never designed for this volume of traffic. When Russia closed its airspace in 2022, Finnair was one of the first carriers to try going over the North Pole instead, routing from Helsinki up past Svalbard, across the Arctic, over Alaska, and then down to Tokyo while carefully skirting Russian airspace. It sounds elegant, but the reality is punishing. The journey went from 5,000 miles to roughly 8,000, adding 4 hours of flight time and burning around 20 extra tons of fuel, a 40% increase. Finnair needed 4 pilots instead of 3 to cover the extended duty time, had to obtain ETOPS 300 certification, allowing their aircraft to fly up to 5 hours from the nearest diversion airport. They found the economics to be so challenging that they ended up prioritizing cargo over passengers on the route. And the operational barriers go beyond just Finnair. Most airlines don't hold ETOPS 300 certification, and obtaining it takes months of regulatory work, specialized crew training, and polar survival equipment. Only a handful of carriers, Finnair, Japan Airlines, KLM, and possibly ANA, have regularly operated these high Arctic routings since the Russian closure. But the biggest problem is geometry. Polar routes can work for a narrow set of connections between Northern Europe and Northeast Asia, where the Great Circle distance actually favors going over the top. For anything headed to Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, or Australasia, which is the bulk of the traffic we're talking about, the maths simply doesn't work, because flying to the North Pole to reach destinations near the equator adds distance rather than saving it. Polar is a niche solution for a handful of carriers on a handful of routes. It cannot replace the Caucasus corridor at any meaningful scale. London to Tokyo via the Atlantic and Pacific would exceed 22 hours. That blows through crew duty time limits. You'd need a technical stop in North America, landing rights, ground handling, fuel, potentially passenger rescreening. No airline would ever do this. It's not a viable option. Airlines would cancel routes. Some become operationally impossible or economically unviable. And the result isn't just expensive tickets, but no tickets at all, as capacity between Europe and Asia collapses. Ticket prices on surviving routes would go through the roof. Cargo capacity drops, hitting supply chains, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, and electronics. And tourism between the continents would take a massive hit, while airlines that are already financially fragile face existential pressure. This would be the single worst disruption to intercontinental aviation since COVID, and arguably worse, because COVID reduced demand while this reduces supply. People want to fly, they just wouldn't be able to. Here is also what most people just take for granted. Global aviation was built on the assumption that airspace is generally open. The routing between Europe and Asia relied on vast stretches of Russian, Middle Eastern, and Central Asian airspace being available. That was a reasonable assumption until it wasn't. In 4 years, we've lost Russia, we've lost Iran and Iraq, and now the entire Gulf corridor has gone dark. What remains is a strip of sky above 2 small countries in the Caucasus. Nobody planned for this. regulators or the airlines. Azerbaijan's air navigation services have done remarkable work absorbing the surge. They've invested heavily in modernizing their systems, deploying performance-based navigation procedures, expanding surveillance coverage. But they're being asked to handle volumes their infrastructure was never designed for. And now drones are hitting airports along the corridor's edge. As you are watching this, hundreds of long-haul flights are threading through that 100-mile gap. British Airways, Lufthansa, Qantas, Singapore Airlines, Cathay Pacific, all of them routing over Georgia and Azerbaijan, because there is nowhere else to go. The Nakhchivan strike is a warning. Not because Azerbaijan is about to enter the war, but because it shows how close the conflict already is to the last viable corridor between two continents. A few more errant drones, a few more escalatory steps, and the connection between Europe and Asia gets severed. That's not a hypothetical. That's the margin we're operating on right now.